Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 59, The Crusades. In this chapter, I recount the long and troubled continuation of the Crusades after the blazing enthusiasm of the First Crusade had cooled into habit, faction, and decline. The Latin kingdoms of the East, founded by the fortunate rashness of the early Crusaders, soon displayed the weaknesses inherent in states that rise quickly but without roots. They were brave but unstable, rich in pomp but poor in statesmanship, and surrounded by a world more unified and more patient than themselves. Against them stood Nureddin, a prince whose austere piety and incorruptible justice even Christian chroniclers were compelled to admire. While the rulers of Jerusalem wasted their treasure in courtly rivalries, Nureddin governed with a severity that inspired both fear and reverence. His court knew no luxury, his revenues were spent on public works, his personal expenses were so humble that the people believed divine favor rested upon him. In contrast, Egypt under the Fatimids had decayed into a spectacle of empty splendor. Palaces filled with perfumes and eunuchs, but devoid of political strength. Its viziers intrigued against one another, its caliphs sank into ceremonial impotence, and the struggle for power invited the armed intervention of both Turks and Franks. It was in this theater of confusion that the rising star of Saladin first appeared. Sent to Egypt as a subordinate officer in the retinue of his uncle Shiraku, he soon revealed the prudence, discipline, and moral gravity that would make him master of both Egypt and Syria. In the ruins of the Fatimid state, he reconstructed a unified Muslim empire, restored Orthodox religion, trained a loyal army, and infused the spirit of jihad with new vigor. By uniting East and South, he accomplished what the Latin princes had always feared, the emergence of a single adversary capable of overwhelming their small and divided settlements. Europe answered this danger with the most imposing enterprise since the First Crusade, the expedition of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. Their arrival before Acre breathed new life into a siege that had dragged on for nearly 2 years. Disease and famine thinned the ranks, but the perseverance of the Crusaders at last forced the city to submit. The massacre of the garrison, carried out by Richard, stained this success and deepened the determination of Saladin, whose firmness in adversity never deserted him. Philip Augustus, more a statesman than a soldier, soon tired of the climate, the quarrels, and the prospects, and withdrew to France, leaving Richard in sole command. Richard embraced the war with the delight of a man whose passions found nourishment in peril. His courage, prodigal and fierce, became a kind of legend. The Saracens believed they saw him wherever the wind stirred the bushes, and mothers were said to frighten their children with his name. His march along the coast from Acre to Joppa was a masterpiece of persistence. For 11 days, the two armies fought without intermission. Saladin's archers swarming like insects around the iron phalanx of the Crusaders. Yet the steady discipline of the Franks, animated by Richard's personal valor, broke every assault. Victory followed victory, towns were retaken, communications restored, and once more the standard of the cross approached Jerusalem. But the nearer they came to the Holy City, the clearer it became that the Crusaders lacked the strength to conquer and hold it. The leaders quarreled, some doubted the feasibility of maintaining a garrison. Others feared the onset of winter. Still others plotted for influence in the Kingdom of Jerusalem rather than striving for Jerusalem itself. Richard, though more eager than any to place the cross upon the walls of Zion, was forced to bow to counsel. Turning away from the city, he is said to have veiled his face and uttered the bitter judgment that those who would not save the Holy Sepulchre were unworthy even to behold it. This moment, tragic in its symbolic weight, marked the last serious opportunity the Crusaders would ever have of recovering Jerusalem by arms. Yet Richard's energy was not exhausted. When Joppa fell to Saladin, he sailed unexpectedly to the shore, leapt into the surf fully armed, and with a tiny force retook the city in one of the most daring enterprises of the age. At dawn, Saladin returned with overwhelming numbers, and for hours the King of England fought surrounded, wielding his sword with such fury that the enemy believed him more than mortal. Reinforcements arrived in time to save him from destruction, but the futility of the struggle was plain. Exhaustion, political necessity, and the impatience of his own subjects compelled Richard to negotiate a truce. It secured free access for Christian pilgrims to the holy places, but restored neither Jerusalem nor the former greatness of the Latin states. The chapter closes with a reflection characteristic of my general view of the Crusades, that their failure was due not only to the strength of the Muslims, but to the vices of the Christians themselves. Their zeal was sincere, but their discipline was weak. Their bravery was undeniable, but their unity fleeting. Their princes were generous in danger, yet petty in counsel. Meanwhile, their adversaries, once divided, had found in Nureddin and Saladin leaders whose virtue, wisdom, and constancy elevated the whole fabric of Islamic power. Thus, the Holy Land, instead of becoming a secure possession of Christendom, became an arena where 4 generations of Europeans wasted their strength, leaving behind little more than ruins, graves, and a melancholy lesson on the limits of enthusiasm when it is not guided by prudence, unity, and understanding. Chapter 60, Fall in the East, Schism, Intrigue, and the Conquest of Constantinople. In this chapter, the narrative turns to the slow collapse of the Eastern Empire, a tragic sequence rooted not merely in external assaults, but in internal decay, religious schism, and the shifting loyalties of restless princes. The deep-rooted separation between Greek and Latin Christianity, which had grown over centuries through theological disputes, most famously the controversy over the Filioque clause, the assertion of supremacy by the Bishop of Rome, and the arrogant disdain on both sides, had long alienated the two halves of Christendom. The prestige and spiritual centrality of the Eastern capital could not prevent the hostility of its own clergy and populace towards the Latin world, whose incursions they regarded with suspicion. The hatred of the Greeks for the Latins and of the Latins for the perceived arrogance of the Greeks had been nurtured by centuries of theological, cultural, and political enmity. Against this background, the reign of Isaac Angelus emerges as pivotal. His maladministration, extravagance, and the arrogance of his brother and relatives inflamed the resentment of the Bulgarian tribes to the north and kindled revolt, while also weakening respect at home. Isaac's failure to quell this uprising, combined with his own cupidity and neglect, led to internal instability. His brother, Alexius Angelus, ultimately seizes power in a coup, promising restoration and reconciliation, but proving unable to heal the fractures within the city or to heal the hatred of the populace who see him as a usurper and traitor. Amidst this turmoil, agents of the West, knights and nobles of France, together with the seafaring Republic of Venice, form an alliance with Alexius Angelus, pledging to restore him to the throne in return for exorbitant sums and future support. They agree that if they can reinstate him, they will assist in healing the schism with the Western Church. Prompted by their debt, the crusading army embarks to Constantinople, after first passing through Zara, where a grim episode occurs. The Crusaders, failing to secure immediate payment, attack and sack a Christian city, Zara, setting a stain on their cause and showing how political greed has crept into a sacred venture. Internal dissension already grows, but they press on. They sail from Venetia, cross treacherous waters, and arrive at Constantinople in 1203. Their first attempt to negotiate with the imperial authorities fails. Emperor Alexius III vacillates and flees, while the city becomes tense. The Crusaders and Venetians manage to enter the suburbs and establish a foothold. The young Alexius Angelus is proclaimed emperor by the Latin leaders, replacing his father. But the people of Constantinople remain suspicious, unwilling to trust this foreign-supported regime. The factions within the city grow hostile. The populace and the clergy denounce the usurper and the foreigners, refuse to pay the enormous tribute demanded, and stir rebellion. The Latin forces respond with violence. The first siege closes, and the fragile new regime fails to consolidate power. Next comes a second phase of conflict, as the Latins, feeling betrayed, muster renewed strength, allies shift, and they storm the city again. In 1204, they breach the walls in a second siege, carrying out the final conquest of Constantinople. The city is sacked, its treasures are pillaged, sacred relics and statues destroyed or carried off, and entire quarters burned. The grandeur of Byzantium collapses in a matter of days. The Latin conquerors divide the spoils, establish a Latin empire, and partition the former territories among themselves, an act both triumphant and ignominious. The fallout for the Greeks is tragic. They are utterly humiliated and plunged into misery. Many citizens flee, many homes and churches are destroyed, and the symbols of empire lie in ruins. The conquerors attempt to reorganize the city, but their rule remains alien, their governance harsh, and the loss endured by the Byzantine population is immense. The spiritual and cultural devastation is sorrowful. Statuary, churches, the greatest monuments of Eastern Christendom are desecrated or destroyed. The former inhabitants, now refugees, wander through the ruins of their past glory. In closing, the chapter reflects on the bitter irony that the fracture between East and West, the religious schism, mutual contempt, and diplomatic failure, opened the door for this catastrophe. Constantinople fell not because of overwhelming force alone, but because of internal division, betrayal, and the convergence of ecclesiastical enmity with political ambition. The Latin conquerors, though victorious, inherit a hollow city, and the Eastern Empire fragmented into successor states. History records both a triumph and a tragedy. The might of the West converged on the East, but the splintering of the Eastern soul made that fall possible and turned victory into a temporary occupation of ashes. Chapter 61: Partition of the Empire by the French and Venetians. In this chapter, the narrative turns from the fall of Constantinople to the strange and almost theatrical process by which the conquerors, French crusaders, and Venetian merchants divided among themselves the ancient dominions of the East. The triumph that had brought them into the palaces of Byzantium had also brought unexpected responsibilities, ambitions, and quarrels. The Latins, flushed with victory yet uneasy in their new position, now confronted the challenge of replacing an empire that had survived 1,000 years with a feudal hierarchy shaped by the customs of the West. Their first concern, after fire and plunder had completed the ruin of Constantinople, was to determine who should assume the throne of the Caesars. By prior agreement, 12 electors, 6 French and 6 Venetians, were appointed to choose the new emperor. They met in the chapel of the palace, invoking the Holy Ghost with all the solemnity the moment demanded, though the practical calculations of politics were never absent from their deliberations. In deference to age, wisdom, and heroic service, the electors first considered the venerable Doge Enrico Dandolo. Yet the Venetians themselves, fearing the dangerous union of republican magistracy with imperial monarchy, rejected the idea. Their refusal left the field open to 2 great candidates, Boniface of Montferrat, a renowned noble of crusading lineage, and Baldwin of Flanders, youthful, admired, modest, and beloved by the army. Boniface withdrew with a dignity befitting his rank, perhaps perceiving that the tide of favor set steadily toward Baldwin. Thus, the young count was elevated to the imperial dignity. Baldwin's coronation in Hagia Sophia imitated the ceremonies of ages past, yet the magnificence could not conceal that the Latin Empire rested on the fragile foundation of a shattered city. Still, his joy echoed through the Crusader camp, and the Franks took pride in having crowned one of their own. Meanwhile, the Venetians secured rewards of a different character, not imperial ornament, but islands, ports, and strategic positions along the sea. They understood that commerce, not ceremony, would determine real power in the new order. The treaty that followed the election divided the Greek Empire into 4 unequal parts. The emperor received a quarter, including Constantinople and the surrounding district. The remainder was shared between the French barons and the Venetian Republic. Each feudatory swore homage to Baldwin, except the Doge, who retained the ambiguous status of a sovereign ally. It was a strange hybrid, a Latin emperor enthroned in the palace of Constantine, surrounded by French knights, protected by Venetian galleys, ruling over a Greek population that regarded him with suspicion and resentment. The Latins quickly discovered that the conquest of the capital was only the beginning of a long and uncertain struggle. The Greek aristocracy, though scattered and humiliated, retained courage, influence, and the memory of their ancient rights. 3 centers of resistance emerged, one in Trebizond under the Comneni, another in Epirus under the House of Angelus, and the most formidable in Nicaea under Theodore Lascaris. While Baldwin attempted to cultivate loyalty in the capital, these Greek princes rallied soldiers and fortified provinces. The Latins began to perceive that they had not replaced a fallen empire so much as provoked the formation of several new ones. Yet Baldwin's earliest and most dangerous enemy was neither Greek nor Turk, but the Bulgarian ruler Johanitsa, whose ambition and ferocity soon turned him into a scourge of the new Latin Empire. When Baldwin's brother Henry marched east to secure the provinces, the emperor himself led a smaller force against the rebels of Adrianople. But the Latins underestimated the tactics of the Comans, the wild horsemen allied with Bulgaria, whose feigned retreats lured the heavy French cavalry into fatal pursuit. Exhausted, encircled, and overwhelmed, Baldwin and his companions were defeated, the Count of Blois was slain, and the emperor himself taken prisoner. Thus, the newly crowned sovereign of Constantinople vanished into captivity, never to return. In the wake of this disaster, the leadership of the Latin Empire fell to Henry of Flanders, a man of sound judgment, steady courage, and a temper suited to both command and compromise. His retreat from Adrianople, conducted under constant harassment from the Comans, displayed a calm discipline rare in that age. Though beset on all sides, Henry held his forces together and by masterful maneuver brought them to safety at the coast, where they rejoined the Venetian fleet. For a time, the survival of the Latin Empire depended entirely on his ability to balance the demands of war with the onset of internal decay. While Henry assumed the regency, the Latins suffered desertions. 7,000 abandoned the city in search of easier fortunes, leaving Constantinople poorly defended and Baldwin's position dangerously exposed. Provinces slipped from Latin control, Greek nobles revived their authority, and the empire that the Crusaders had imagined as a glittering prize shrank into a few fortresses and the walls of the capital itself. The Venetians, meanwhile, consolidated their dominion over the coasts and islands, shaping the eastern Mediterranean to their mercantile advantage. Their astute governance contrasted sharply with the feudal disarray among the French barons, whose ambitions were usually too grand for their means and too narrow for the state they were supposed to defend. Amid the political upheavals, Gibbon pauses to recount the remarkable story of the Courtenay family, whose branches extended from France to England and Byzantium. The French Courtenays, through marriage and fortune, acquired princely rank in Edessa and later claimed imperial blood in Constantinople. Their fall from these lofty heights illustrates the fragility of medieval nobility. The pomp of yesterday becomes the poverty of today. The last emperors of their line wandered Europe seeking aid to preserve their shadowy dignity, while distant cousins in England quietly prospered as noble country gentlemen. Few tales better reveal the dazzling mise and melancholy decline that accompanied the Crusader presence in the East. The chapter ends with a reflection on the paradox of the Latin conquest. They seized Constantinople with boldness, but lacked the unity, foresight, and local support needed to rule it. The Greeks, humiliated yet resilient, founded new states and prepared the long struggle that would ultimately expel the Latins. The Venetians profited, but at the cost of creating enemies whose hostility would endure for centuries. And the French Crusaders, who believed themselves masters of an empire, found instead that they had inherited a burden beyond their strength. The Latin Empire was born in triumph, but its foundations were already cracked. Its rulers wielded the title of Roman emperor, yet commanded little more than a wounded city and a restless population. Thus, Gibbon portrays chapter 61 as a lesson in the vanity of conquest, the perils of ambition without prudence, and the enduring truth that empires cannot be built where understanding, loyalty, and stability are absent. Chapter 62. The Greek Emperors at Nicaea and Constantinople. In this chapter, I trace the unexpected resurrection of the Greek Empire after the catastrophe of 1204, when Constantinople fell to the Latins and the proud Byzantine world seemed destined for extinction. Yet, as so often in history, ruin became the seed of renewal. Driven from their ancient capital, the Greeks retreated across the Bosporus to Asia Minor, where the city of Nicaea, once the seat of an ecumenical council, became the refuge of a battered but unbroken nation. Here, under the guidance of Theodore Lascaris, a small yet resolute state was formed, a kind of miniature Byzantium in exile. Though surrounded by enemies and deprived of its imperial splendor, this new court displayed virtues that adversity often compels: discipline, austerity, and a loyalty to the imperial name that had begun to fade during the luxury of earlier reigns. Theodore Lascaris, the founder of this exiled empire, governed not with the hollow ceremonials of Constantinople, but with genuine vigor. He was less a monarch than a commander of a fortified camp, ruling 3 cities and a handful of soldiers with the dignity of a sovereign. The Turks pressed upon his borders, the Latins threatened from the sea, and pretenders to the throne emerged from every corner of the fractured Greek world. Yet, Theodore's courage, supported by the quiet endurance of his people, preserved Nicaea as a sanctuary of Greek independence. His reign was a struggle for mere survival, but that survival prepared the ground for something greater. Upon his death, the scepter passed to his son-in-law, John Vatacis, a ruler of far wider vision. If Theodore had saved the state, Vatacis rebuilt it. Under his wise administration, fields once scorched by war were replanted, harbors restored, and laws enforced with a justice that reminded the people of the best days of the old empire. Vatacis understood that an empire is not secured by the glitter of its court, but by the prosperity of his subjects. He encouraged agriculture, restricted the import of foreign luxuries, and turned the energies of the Greeks toward the useful arts. Even his frugality became an instrument of power. The wealth he accumulated was directed not to palaces, but to armies and fortresses. Slowly, patiently, he expanded the Nicaean state, taking advantage of Latin weakness and Greek discontent, until he stood as the undisputed champion of the Byzantine cause. After Vatacis came his young son, too inexperienced to wield imperial authority, and into this vacuum stepped Michael Palaiologos, a nobleman whose ambition equaled his ability. He possessed a lineage the Greeks revered, the military talent the state urgently needed, and the political dexterity that could charm his allies while disarming his enemies. Accused, exiled, recalled, and suspected in turn, Michael navigated the treacherous currents of Byzantine politics with a mixture of boldness and caution. And when the moment arrived, he seized the throne not merely for himself, but for the restoration of Byzantine greatness. His opportunity came in 1261, when a small Nicaean force, acting more by fortune than by grand design, slipped into Constantinople through a neglected gate and captured the city almost without resistance. At the news, Michael hastened across the Bosporus to reclaim the capital of Constantine. What he found was not the queen of cities, but a wounded ruin. Streets empty, palaces blackened by fire, churches despoiled, and commerce extinct. The Latin conquerors had ruled for nearly 60 years, yet had never succeeded in winning the hearts of their subjects or restoring the prosperity of the metropolis. Their departure left behind a shell of a city, glorious only in memory. But for Michael, the desolation itself was a summons. Here, amid the rubble, he would revive the empire. Michael Palaiologos was crowned in Hagia Sophia with all the solemnity the impoverished state could muster, and he entered upon the labor of restoring a city and a kingdom at once. He repopulated Constantinople by inviting Greeks from every province, rebuilt its walls and harbors, and revived the trade that nature had destined the city to command. Yet, the emperor soon found that his greatest dangers did not come from the weakened Latins, but from the West, where the papacy and powerful princes sought vengeance for the loss of their eastern conquest. The most formidable of these was Charles of Anjou, whose dreams of empire stretched from Sicily to Asia. Against such a foe, Michael relied less on arms than on diplomacy. He offered to reconcile the Greek Church with Rome, a pledge he never intended to fulfill sincerely, in order to split his enemies and delay invasion. His concession, though shrewd, provoked bitter anger among his own clergy and people, who saw in it a betrayal of their faith. The emperor thus stood isolated, distrusted abroad and hated at home. Yet he maintained his course with the stubborn resolve of a man who believes himself the only bulwark against national ruin. After Michael's death, his son Andronicus II inherited an empire restored in borders but not in strength. Where the father had been bold, the son was contemplative. Where Michael had bent religion to political necessity, Andronicus submitted politics to monastic devotion. His reign, though long, saw more decline than recovery. The treasury emptied, the army decayed, and the fleet was dismissed to save expenses. The Turks, once checked, now advanced into Asia Minor. Provinces were lost not by defeat, by neglect. And when danger multiplied, Andronicus turned not to generals, but to monks, whose rivalries and visions seemed to him more pressing than the frontiers of the empire. Thus, the Greek revival, so heroically won at Nicaea and triumphantly completed in Constantinople, began once more to dim under weakness within and menace without. Yet, the chapter ends not in despair, but in the recognition that the Byzantine spirit could rise from disaster. It had done so after 1204. It would attempt to do so again. The empire restored by Lascaris, strengthened by Vatasis, and glorified by Michael Palaiologos was fragile, but it was alive. And for a people whose history blended endurance with misfortune, mere survival was often the seed of future greatness. Chapter 63: Civil Wars and the Decline of the Greek Empire. In this chapter, I recount one of the most melancholy spectacles in the long tragedy of Byzantium, the internal conflicts that consumed the empire from within at the very moment when its enemies pressed upon it from without. The fall of Constantinople to the Latins in 1204 had been a disaster, yet even after the Greeks regained their capital in 1261, they could not recover the vigor or discipline needed to defend their precarious revival. Instead, they became entangled in a succession of civil wars, struggles not for national survival but for personal ambition, while the rising power of the Ottoman Turks slowly encircled them. It is a mournful truth that the empire was never more capable of unity than when it had lost the ability to use it. The chapter opens with the reign of Andronicus the Elder, a prince who possessed, in unequal measure, both the virtues and the weakness of a contemplative spirit. His mind was sharpened by study, his manners softened by piety, but his government was enfeebled by austerity, indecision, and a constant reliance on the monasteries whose superstitions he indulged. The treasury emptied under the weight of idle courtiers and religious foundations, the army decayed for want of pay, and foreign mercenaries, once the shield of the empire, became its tormentors. Amid this decline, the empire still retained one asset, its geographical position, but even this advantage was squandered by rulers who preferred theological disputes to frontier defenses. Theodore and Manuel, two influential princes, further disturbed the harmony of the palace, while the young Andronicus the Younger, grandson of the emperor, found his ambition inflamed by the neglect and mistrust of his elders. A series of quarrels, conspiracies, and misunderstandings soon severed the bond between grandfather and grandson. The younger prince, popular among the soldiers and admired for his vigor, became the rallying point for discontent. The elder, burdened by age and counseled by timid advisors, hesitated at the moment when firmness might have prevented revolt. Suspicion, once awakened, widened into hostility, and hostility erupted into open civil war. Thus began the first of the destructive contests between Andronicus II and Andronicus III. Cities declared for one or the other, as though choosing between rival factions rather than rulers of a threatened state. The empire was divided not by geography, but by personal loyalty, family alliances, and private injuries. For 8 years the struggle continued. Battles were fought in Thrace, the Hellespont was crossed by contending fleets, and the treasures of the church were squandered to pay mercenaries. Yet neither side possessed the strength to impose a decisive victory until the elder emperor, worn down by age and calamity, finally yielded. He accepted monastic retirement with a resignation that seemed to confess the futility of his reign. His grandson ascended the throne, but the empire he inherited was only the shadow of what it had been. Andronicus III was brave, active, and capable. He possessed the qualities most lacking in his grandfather. Yet his reign was short, and he lacked the long discipline of adversity that forms a great ruler. Though he won several victories against the Serbs and Bulgarians, restored order for a moment, and sought to rebuild the army, he died prematurely, leaving his throne to a child and his empire to the mercy of ambitious men. The death of a prince so young plunged Byzantium into a second and still more disastrous civil war. John Cantacuzene, the friend, minister, and guardian of the late emperor, was the most powerful man in the empire and perhaps the only one capable of saving it. But his virtues were precisely those that inspire envy. He had been raised with Andronicus, shared his triumphs, and governed in his name. His influence was great, his conduct upright, and his ancestry noble. The empress mother, suspicious of his authority, and the courtiers, fearful of his reforms, conspired to remove him. What began as an intrigue soon widened into rebellion, and Cantacuzene, driven to desperation, was proclaimed emperor by his supporters. The Second Civil War now spread through the empire like a contagion. Entire provinces passed from one faction to another. The forces of Cantacuzene and those of the Regency fought across Thrace, Macedonia, and the Aegean. Yet the true misfortune of Byzantium lay not in the battles themselves, but in the foreign alliances both sides invoked. To strengthen their cause, the rivals summoned barbarian auxiliaries, whose loyalty could never be trusted, and whose presence introduced a new and deadly force into the affairs of the Greeks. Chief among these auxiliaries were the Ottoman Turks, arriving people who had already established themselves in Asia Minor, but who had not yet crossed decisively into Europe. Both factions courted their support, offering rich bribes and even allowing them to settle temporarily in Thrace. The Turks, delighted by these invitations, entered the conflict with predictable vigor. They fought first for one emperor, then for the other, plundering indiscriminately and learning with astonishing speed the geography and weaknesses of the European provinces. What neither Andronicus nor Cantacuzene realized was that in calling in the Turks, they had opened the gate through which a new and inexorable conqueror would one day pass. Cantacuzene ultimately triumphed and entered Constantinople in a manner that resembled both a triumph and a funeral procession. He took the throne, but his victory was poisoned by the memory of the destruction the war had inflicted, and by the distrust of a population that saw in him the architect of its misery. His reign was troubled, his reforms contested, and his conscience burdened by the knowledge that the Turks, once admitted, could no longer be expelled. Discontent among the Greeks soon revived. Cantacuzene faced conspiracies from within and hostility from those loyal to the young emperor, John V Palaiologos, now of age and eager to reclaim authority. A final, desperate struggle between the old emperor and the young resulted in Cantacuzene's abdication. He chose the cloister over the palace, exchanging the intrigues of empire for the pen of a historian, and leaving behind a throne more fragile than ever. The chapter closes with a somber recognition that the civil wars had consumed the strength of Byzantium more effectively than any foreign enemy. The empire, weakened by decades of internal conflict, had allowed the Ottomans, invited first as auxiliaries, tolerated then as allies, to establish a foothold in Europe. What the Latins had done in one terrible blow in 1204, the Greeks had now done gradually to themselves. They had prepared their own subjugation. The tragedy of Byzantium was not only that it fell, but that it had exhausted its last resources in fratricidal struggles while the real enemy gathered force at its very gates. Chapter 64: The Mongols and the Rise of the Ottoman Turks. In this chapter, I turn from the internal ruin of Byzantium to the far grander movements that reshaped the whole face of Asia and ultimately sealed the fate of the Eastern Empire: the whirlwind conquest of the Mongols and the slow, steady rise of the Ottoman Turks. If the Greeks suffered from the feuds of their princes, the East groaned beneath the weight of forces so vast and so irresistible that no human prudence could have diverted their course. For a time, these two powers, the sudden tempest of the Mongols and the patient tide of the Ottomans, shared the stage, but they differed profoundly in nature. The first swept across kingdoms with the fury of an elemental storm. The second advanced with the methodical certainty of a new civilization. The narrative begins with the astonishing rise of Genghis Khan, a man who rose from obscurity among the tribes of Mongolia to dominate half the world with a speed that no conqueror before or since has equaled. The genius of Genghis lay not in philosophical vision or imperial administration, but in his mastery of war and in the ruthless clarity with which he understood power. His armies, hardened by the rigors of nomadic life, moved with an agility unknown to the civilized nations of Asia. They annihilated resistance with cold efficiency, and in their wake, cities vanished, populations perished, and entire provinces were reduced to deserts. From the Great Wall of China to the plains of Persia, from the Volga to the Ganges, the Mongols extinguished kingdoms as one blows out candles in a storm. Their destruction was immense, their purpose simple: conquest for its own sake. The prodigious victories of Genghis were continued by his descendants, who divided the vast empire into separate khanates but maintained the same relentless spirit. The Mongol advance into Russia crushed the princes of the north beneath their iron discipline. Hungary and Poland trembled as their armies approached, and Europe was saved not by its own strength, but by the death of the Great Khan, which recalled the Mongol generals to the east. Thus, the Western world escaped the fate of Samarkand, Bokhara, Nishapur, and Baghdad, cities that, once the centers of civilization, fell silent beneath the hoofs of the conquerors. While the Mongols ravaged the east, the Byzantine Empire watched with a mixture of horror and relief. The storm passed near enough to shake its walls, but not close enough to destroy it. Yet the respite was deceptive. For even as the Mongols conquered and retreated, they left behind a broken political landscape that invited a new power to rise. That power was the Ottoman Turks. At the time of their emergence, the Ottomans were merely one tribe among many in fragmented Anatolia. Yet fortune, discipline, and religious zeal combined to lift them above their rivals. Their founder, Osman, began his career as a small frontier chieftain, raiding the decaying Greek provinces that lay closest to his mountain stronghold. His warriors were bound to him not by feudal chains, but by faith, plunder, and a sense of belonging to a community destined to expand. Under Osman, their raids became organized campaigns. Under his son Orhan, they became the foundation of a new state. The capture of Prusa, Bursa, marked the Ottomans' first great achievement, giving them a permanent capital in Asia and transforming a roving warband into a settled polity. The genius of the Ottomans lay in their ability to combine the fierce vigor of their nomadic origins with the administrative and military innovations they adopted from their subject peoples. They forged a disciplined infantry, the Janissaries, by training youths taken as tribute from Christian families, educating them in the arts of war, and binding them by loyalty to the Sultan alone. This unprecedented institution furnished the empire with a corps of soldiers who were simultaneously slaves, elite warriors, and guardians of the state. The Ottomans also learned from the administrative systems of the Seljuk sultans and the Byzantines themselves, creating a flexible, efficient bureaucracy. By the time the Greeks regained Constantinople in 1261, the Ottomans were already poised to take advantage of the empire's exhaustion. The Latins had left the capital in ruins. The Paleologan restoration lacked money, manpower, and unity. Asia Minor, once the heartland of the Byzantine world, had become a patchwork of Turkish emirates. Into this vacuum the Ottomans pressed steadily. Their early conquests were modest but relentless. Towns surrendered, fortresses fell, populations migrated or submitted. The Byzantines, embroiled in civil conflicts and weakened by theological disputes, offered little resistance. The chapter reaches its dramatic center with the reigns of Murad I and Bayezid I, two sultans who transformed the Ottoman principality into a European power. Murad's conquests in Thrace and Macedonia were decisive. He established Adrianople as his European capital and forced the Greeks into humiliating treaties. His armies, composed of Turks, Christians, and mercenaries alike, advanced with a unity that their opponents never matched. When Murad fell in battle at Kosovo, he left behind an empire whose foundations were already more stable than that of Byzantium. His successor, Bayezid, known to history as the Thunderbolt, moved with a speed that justified his name. He completed the encirclement of Constantinople, reducing the city to dependence on his mercy. In a gesture that revealed the shift of power, he demanded tribute from the Byzantine emperor and compelled the building of a mosque within the capital itself, an omen of the empire's future. Yet Bayezid's ambition led him into the one conflict that checked the Ottoman ascent, his fateful confrontation with the conqueror Timur. The clash between Bayezid and Timur stands as one of the great collisions of medieval Asia. Bayezid, fierce and impetuous, boasted that he would drive Timur back to the steppes. Timur, cold and calculating, replied with contempt. Their armies met at Ankara in 1402, and the result was the annihilation of the Ottoman forces. Bayezid was taken prisoner, his empire dissolved into chaos, and for a moment the advance of the Ottomans faltered. But the respite for Byzantium was illusory. Timur departed as swiftly as he had come, leaving ruin but not reconstruction. The Ottoman princes, after a period of fratricidal struggle, reunited their domains under the firm leadership of Mehmed I and Murad II. Once restored, the empire resumed its methodical expansion with renewed strength. The chapter closes with the reflection that while the Mongols had terrified the world only to vanish like a storm, the Ottomans advanced with the steady determination of a rising civilization. The Mongols destroyed, the Ottomans built. And it was the Ottomans, disciplined, organized, and inspired by faith, who stood at the gates of Constantinople, ready to claim as their prize the city the Mongols had spared. Thus, the fate of Byzantium lay not in sudden catastrophe, but in the silent, relentless tide of a power that grew while the empire suffered, fought among itself, and prayed for deliverance that never came. Chapter 65. The Rise and Death of Tamerlane, Timur, the lame conqueror of Central Asia, whose career forms one of the most astonishing episodes in the annals of human ambition. Emerging from the barren plains of Transoxiana, he rose from the chief of a small and turbulent tribe to the master of an empire extending from Moscow to Delhi, from the Mediterranean to the Great Wall of China. If earlier chapters described the gradual decay of Byzantia, here the narrative expands to a wider stage, revealing a conqueror whose actions reshaped Asia itself, and whose shadow fell even upon the destiny of the Greeks. Yet the life of Timur is significant not merely for the scale of his victories, but for the character of the man who achieved them. For in him we witness the strange combination of method and savagery, of strategic foresight and unrestrained destruction that marks the greatest yet most terrible leaders of antiquity. Timur was born near Samarkand, in a land long accustomed to producing warriors hardened by climate and necessity. He inherited neither noble titles nor a flourishing realm. Instead, he inherited the perpetual disorder of shifting alliances among Turkish tribes. With a patience unknown to the wild chiefs around him, he learned to disguise his ambition beneath the mask of loyalty, to cultivate friendships he would later use, and to turn the quarrels of others into opportunities for himself. When his moment arrived, he seized it with that decisive energy that always distinguishes the founder from the adventurer. The tribes rallied to his banner, the chiefs who opposed him perished, and Samarkand, ancient jewel of the East, became his capital. From this center, he began his campaigns, each greater than the last. Persia, weakened by civil war, became his first great conquest. Cities were taken, emirs defeated, and ancient dynasties extinguished. Yet Timur's method did not resemble the refined statecraft of an Alexander or Augustus. His rule advanced on two pillars, fear and profit. Those who submitted were rewarded with the security of life and property. Those who resisted were crushed by a cruelty so systematic that it acquired the cold regularity of law. The towers of skulls he raised over the ruins of cities were not born of caprice, but served as dreadful proclamations of imperial authority. Having subdued Persia, Timur turned to the regions of Georgia and Armenia, then to Mesopotamia, where he vanquished the heirs of the caliphs and reduced Baghdad to a silent monument of destruction. Yet conquest itself seemed merely a prelude to larger visions. At the age when most kings would rest, Timur looked further east and west. To the east lay India, fragmented and wealthy. To the west lay the powerful Ottoman Empire under its formidable Sultan Bayezid. The first he conquered for glory, the second he confronted in rivalry. His march into India was one of the boldest enterprises recorded in Eastern history. Through deserts, mountains, and rivers, his army advanced with the precision of a machine. Delhi fell after a brief but furious campaign, and the treasures of the subcontinent were gathered to enrich Samarkand. But even the triumph of India did not satisfy his ambition, for Timur measured his achievements not against the limits of nature, but against the memory of Genghis Khan. To equal the Mongol founder, he believed he must humble the Ottomans, those rising lords of Asia who threatened to overshadow his glory. The confrontation between Timur and Bayezid was inevitable. Bayezid, swift and ferocious, had subdued the Turks of Anatolia, defeated European armies, and pinned the Greeks within their shrinking capital. His challenge to Timur was as bold as it was reckless. Letters between the two monarchs set the stage for their conflict, filled with insults only conquerors dare exchange. Bayezid mocked Timur as a marauder. Timur replied by calling Bayezid a presumptuous servant of fortune. Beneath these words lay the struggle of two empires, two worldviews, and two ambitions too vast to coexist. Their armies met on the plain of Ankara in 1402. Timur brought with him the hardened veterans of Central Asia. Bayezid commanded the finest cavalry of the Ottoman world. Yet fortune favored the older conqueror. The heat, the exhaustion of the Ottomans, the desertions of Turkish vassals, and the superior maneuvering of Timur's forces produced a disaster unparalleled in Ottoman history. Bayezid was taken prisoner, his empire dissolved overnight, and Timur stood once more unrivaled in the East. Yet even this colossal victory revealed the tragic vanity of his ambition, for though he had humbled a rival, he had given no lasting peace to the nations he passed through. The lands he conquered did not flourish under his rule, they merely ceased to resist it. Now, in the last stage of his life, Timur conceived one final and magnificent project, the conquest of China. The empire of the Ming was torn by rebellion, its walls seemed vulnerable, and Timur, whose imagination expanded with age, believed that destiny had reserved for him the complete domination of Asia. It was a fitting dream for one who had turned Samarkand into a court of dazzling magnificence, where ambassadors from distant lands paid homage among towers, gardens, and mosques adorned with gold and lapis. Yet this dream proved fatal. At the head of an enormous army, Timur set out across the steppes in winter, defying a climate that had defeated kings before him. But age, which had spared him in war, betrayed him in the cold. As he advanced toward China, he fell ill at Otrar and died in 1405, surrounded not by the splendor of his capital, nor by the shouts of victory, but by the desolate winds of the frontier he had not yet crossed. With his death, the unity of his empire dissolved instantly, for it had rested on his personal genius, not on institutions capable of surviving him. His sons quarreled, his generals carved out independent realms, and the dream of a universal empire vanished like smoke. The chapter closes with reflections on Timur's legacy, an uneasy mixture of admiration and horror. He possessed every gift of the conqueror: courage, strategic brilliance, and an iron will. Yet he lacked the gentler virtues that build lasting civilizations. Where he passed, cities burned, populations dwindled, and cultures collapsed. Unlike the Ottomans, who built a durable state upon their conquests, Timur left behind only ruins and legends. His name fills the imagination with awe, yet his achievements, vast as they were, perished almost as swiftly as the armies that obeyed him. Thus, the career of Tamerlane stands as a monumental example of the truth that empire built solely on the sword may dazzle the world for a moment, but it cannot endure beyond the life of the man who wields it.